let a few more people in here, then we'll get started. All right. Well, thank you everyone for being here today. This is the very first webinar in our series, our fall webinar series. I'm letting a few more people in here. Give me 1 second. This webinar is being recorded. Afterwards, the recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, and a link will be made available to those who have requested it. For anyone who may be new to Wild Ones or hasn't heard of us yet, we are a nonprofit 501c3 organization that's dedicated to promoting environmentally sound landscaping practices that preserve biodiversity through the preservation, restoration, and establishment of native plant communities. Wild Ones has been in Arkansas since 2019 when the Central Arkansas chapter was chartered last year. Then earlier this year, we chartered a chapter here in the Ozarks, Northwest Arkansas. If you're interested in learning more about Wild Ones, you can go to our website at wildones.org. And if you're interested in joining our chapter and becoming a member, go to wildones.org/membership. And there you'll see that there are different options for membership, different tiers based on your income and how much you can afford. It can go as low as $25 for people on limited income or students. We don't want financial limitations to prevent anyone from being able to join. When you join, you just choose the chapter that you want to be a part of. And like I said, we are the Ozark Chapter here in Northwest Arkansas. If you're in Central Arkansas, or you would join the Central Arkansas chapter. One of the things that our chapter is doing is we're going to have these webinar series. I'd plan on another one for the spring. Hope to have these twice a year. We are also having producing a quarterly newsletter. We came out with our summer issue not long ago, and we're working currently and accepting submissions for our fall issue. We're accepting articles and announcements or any photos or anything you would like to submit related to our mission to wildonesozarkchapter@gmail.com. You can also check us out on Facebook at facebook.com/OzarkWildOnes. And like I said, this is the first in the series of our webinars. We have 3 more on Wednesday, October 14th. Kitty Sanders with the Botanical Garden of the Ozarks will be speaking on monarchs and her talk called Be a Friend to Monarchs and Other Pollinators. On Thursday, October 22nd, we'll have a webinar on invasive plants in Arkansas and why they matter with Dr. Don Steinkraus. And then on Thursday, November 5th, Cody George with the Thaden School and also former horticulturalist with Crystal Bridges will be speaking on ecological land care, integrating horticulture with ecology. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Megan, who hails from a small farming village in upstate New York. Megan's love of nature and plants comes from a childhood spent hiking, camping, canoeing, and playing in the great outdoors. Her foray into horticulture began with the inception of her first vegetable garden in her mid-20s. Since then, she has completed a Bachelor of Science in Horticulture at the University of Arkansas, grew from an intern at the Botanical Garden of the Ozarks to its horticulture supervisor, and has fallen in love with native plants and their role in the ecosystem. At home, Megan has various garden spaces, including a vegetable garden, a Zen garden, pollinator garden, and a high tunnel. Megan lives with her husband, Chris, their 2 dogs, 5 chickens, and a snake just outside of Fayetteville. They are expecting their first child in November of this year. Today, Megan's going to talk to us about the value of gardening with native plants and how to draw insects into our yard and to keep them there long term. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Megan Langford.
Thank you so much, Eric, for introducing me, and thank you everybody for being here today. I'm really excited to share with you my presentation and my love for natives. And also for insects, and kind of give you some basics on how they are all integrated together and how we can do different things in our yard to support nature's food web, starting with native plants. So I do want to talk just a touch about Botanical Garden of the Ozarks, of course, because that's where my love of natives started. We are a 501c3 in Fayetteville, Arkansas. We have several display gardens showing what you can do in your own backyard. And starting a few years ago, we really made a concerted effort to start integrating more natives into the entire garden, not just the natives garden, in order to support the ecosystem. So if you haven't visited us, please do. Right now is an amazing time of year, as long as we don't get a frost tomorrow night. You can see some of the talk about today at the Botanical Garden of the Ozarks. So today we're going to talk about native plants, what the problem is, why we need to plant more native plants, what we can do in our yards, and how it supports the whole ecosystem. I do want to talk a little bit about insects and why I love them so much. I think people find them icky, they're scary, something that we're not as familiar with. I really fell in love with them when I was at the university taking a couple of entomology courses. I found out that they are diverse in their size and their role in the ecosystem. They are beautiful. Even the ones, in the tropics, they have just these amazing colors, but our native insects are just as beautiful if we take the time to slow down and look at them. They are intelligent and they communicate in so many different ways. They communicate with pheromones, touch, sound, movement, and even light. So if you've ever seen a line of ants, one following right after the other, they've laid down a trail of pheromones for the nest to follow in order to find food sources. I think most, if not all of us, have magical memories of lightning bugs as children, watching them dance in the sky. That's actually the ones that we see dance, those are males, and they're putting on a light show for the females, saying, hey, I've got the best light show, you want to mate with me. As someone who grew up in the north, where we don't have what I call the sound of summer or cicadas, it is my absolute favorite sound in summer. That trill or that loud buzzing sound that we hear, starting in July and going through until about the first frost, that's the male calling to the female. He's up in the tree and he's, singing this sweet song. And when she hears the song that she likes the best, she makes a noise back to him. Somehow he knows that she's talking to him, and they mate. And then most cicadas actually spend a decade or more underground, and that's where most of their life cycle takes place. And then perhaps the most amazing form of communication that I know of through insects is the waggle dance of the honeybee. So with a figure 8 movement, a little waggle of their body, and how fast that waggle is, they can actually communicate to their hive mates how far away a food source is and the direction that it is in relation to the sun. So it's so amazing the different ways that insects communicate. And I really encourage you to get to know them better and understand how important they are. And that's what we're going to start to talk about today. So both native plants and insects are the base of the entire food web. And you're going to hear me say this probably at least 10 more times throughout this presentation, because I really want to get across just how absolutely important they are. Before we get started, I do need to mention my natives mentor, Lissa Morrison. She's the person that got me interested in natives. She was my supervisor at the Botanical Garden of the Ozarks. She is a native plant educator and designer. She is a dear friend, and she is also the vice president of the Ozark Chapter of Wild Ones. Much of the research that you will see in the beginning of this presentation is research that Lissa has so generously shared with me so that I could add to some other presentations that I already had and make this more robust presentation that really gets people hopefully to understand the importance of native plants and native insects. And not just pollinators, although they are very important, but just insects in general. So why is this called more than milkweed? So what I have seen, and it's starting to change, which makes me very hopeful for the future, is that there's been this great education on monarchs and the monarch plight But there are so many other insects that if we really want to help nature, help the world, we have to concentrate on more than just monarchs and more than just milkweed. So that's what we're going to talk about today is, yes, monarchs are very important, but there's so much more to the picture and we need to really broaden our horizons. One thing I want you to think about as we go through this presentation as well is a quote from Doug Tallamy, which I had the honor of seeing him speak a couple of years ago. And we'll also talk about some of his research along with what Lissa has so generously shared with me as we go through this presentation. And that's that nearly every creature on this planet owes its existence to plants. So it's something that's very important that we have to remember. Something I want you to also think about and keep in mind, not just as we go through today's presentation, but as you garden really for the rest of your life, to not be upset that there are holes in your leaves, but rather to rejoice in knowing that you provided a meal for a wild neighbor. I think in gardening, the way we're classically trained, we want these pristine, beautiful gardens with no holes in them. But the whole point of planting native plants and supporting the ecosystem is that some of our leaves are going to get eaten, and that's okay, because that's why we're planting those plants, is we're planting them not just to enjoy, but to support the ecosystem as well. So before we talk about, what we can do, we have to figure out, well, what is the problem? Why is it so important for us to plant native plants? So humans, we have forever changed the face of the planet through loss of habitat, habitat fragmentation. According to Doug Tallamy, 70% of the forests along our eastern seaboards are gone, which means that tons of food sources for our native insects have also disappeared. In 1900, 40% of the US population was urban, but there were only 76 million of us. Today, 83% of our population is urban, and there are at least 330 million people in the United States. So you can see that that really makes a huge difference in the amount of food that is available to our native insects. Also pesticides, not just in agriculture, but what we use at home. I'll encourage you several times to either not use pesticides at home or to be very selective in what you use. We have to think about, you think, oh, well, it's just my yard. But if it's just your yard and millions of other people's yards, that really adds up to be as much, if not possibly more, than the amount of space that we spray pesticides over our agricultural fields. Invasive plants, they take up space and nutrients and outcompete our native plants. Oftentimes they leaf out earlier, thus shading the seedlings that may come up. And so our native seedlings don't make it because the invasives have shaded them out. And you'll find as we go along, they don't support the ecosystem. Yes, occasionally non-native or invasive plants will be used by our insects, but by and large, native plants do much more to support our ecosystem than do non-native or invasive plants. And then agricultural practices, monoculture. So monoculture is things like a huge cornfield or a huge soybean field. Unfortunately, the way that we have grown in our agricultural system, they don't support our pollinators. They may have some pollen, but as if you were to just eat one type of food, you're not going to get the nutrients that you need. It also doesn't supply the host plants that, again, we'll be talking about a lot, where the caterpillar or certain stages of the life stage of an insect where they can only eat one or several types of plants. Also, land degradation. So sometimes the land is so degraded that it just can't support the native plants, or it doesn't support them in a healthy way. And so they're not able to support our pollinators. And then of course, pesticides, broad spectrum pesticides, massive amounts of pesticides. That makes a huge difference in our insect population because especially the broad spectrum ones, they don't target specific insects. They just kill whatever they come in contact with. Also want to mention many of all but probably 2 or 3 of the pictures that you'll see throughout this presentation are pictures that I've taken myself. I love this one. This was taken at the Botanical Garden of the Ozarks. What I love is you can see this adorable bright orange pollen sac on the back of this native bee. She's been buzzing around the garden collecting, and she's going to take that back to her nest. Okay, so why should we care if we have insects, or why should we care if we have native plants? Well, we care because native plants and insects, as I said before, are the base of the entire food web. So you see at the very bottom of this food web or food pyramid, we have our native plants. Those native plants then support insects. And then from the insects, the birds eat those, or skunks or possums or mice or a variety of other animals. And then from there, the foxes and owls eat them, and then so on up the food chain. So if you take out that base layer of the native plants and then the second layer of the insects, then everything else starts to collapse. So it's really important that we understand and support that relationship. 37% of animals are herbivores that are insects. So 37% of our animals are insects that eat plants. So it just makes that relationship that much more concrete, understanding that such a high percentage of what supports the base of the food web are insects that will then be eaten by other animals. Many animals depend directly on insects for food, so not just birds, but frogs, mice, armadillos, moles, reptiles, amphibians, bats, even other insects. So again, they're just such an important part of the food web. Here in the natural state, it's because we love nature, and in even many other parts of the country. You know, so many of us, we love to watch the birds fly through the air. We love all of the different animals, maybe not all, most of the other animals that we share our world with, and we want to support them. And we want to make sure that they're around for our kids, for our grandkids, and for future generations to come. And because we love to eat, we can't eat if we don't have pollinators. You know, not just bees, butterflies, wasps. There are so many important pollinators, and especially native bees are very important to our ecosystem. And in order for us to eat, we need to have those native bees. So that's what we're talking about today. Other reasons why we should care. We're seeing a sharp decline in the population of other animals. So a 29% decline in bird population, a 50% decline in butterflies, 41% of pollinators, and 40% of amphibians. And we, as humans, we depend on the ecosystem services that nature provides. So food, clean air and water, mitigation of climate change, medicine, and so much more. Without nature, without her functioning properly and all those systems working together, we lose those ecosystem services. So it's very important to us as humans, not just because we love nature, but because we depend on her as well. All right, so we understand now, or have a better understanding of what the problem is, why it's important, but what is the role of native plants? Why are they important? So before we talk about why they're important, I want to define what a native plant is. You'll hear a lot of different explanations, but the best explanation that I have heard was from Doug Talmy, and it was that they are plants that have evolved in a certain area and provide ecosystem services. And most especially, that's going to be food for insects. And so that's why native plants are important. And we'll get a little more into depth in that and as we go. Non-native plants don't have to be from another country. They can be from another state. They can even be from another area in your state. And, you know, if they haven't evolved in the area that you're in alongside those insects or those animals, they're not going to provide the ecosystem services that we are hoping to provide when we plant native plants. All right, so why should we plant native plants? So they provide pollinator habitat and food. According to Doug Tallamy, natives support 3.2 many times as herbivores as non-native plants, and 35 times more caterpillar biomass than non-natives. Natives also increase the number of pollinators, birds, and amphibians, again supporting the entire food web. They provide food, fiber, medicine for humans, natural pest control. They buffer storms. They increase soil fertility, reduce erosion, store carbon. They provide wildlife habitat. And again, for us as humans, they provide recreation. I know for me, I grew up hiking, camping, canoeing. I spent most of my time as a child outside, outdoors, and just it's such an amazing place to be. It helps you be happy, healthy, and it's just a wonderful thing that we can share with Mother Nature. So other reasons. So I think this is where, for me, the relationship between native plants and the food web really was cemented for me, where it really began to take shape and make me understand just how important native plants are. According to Doug Tallamy, 90% of insects are specialists. So that means that they can only eat one species or several species within a genus of plants. So for example, we talk about the monarchs and milkweed. You can't just take a monarch caterpillar and put it on any plant and it be able to eat it. It's not able to do that. The reason is that it has evolved with milkweed, and it's able to eat the chemicals in milkweed and not have it harm it, whereas it's not able to eat other plants and be able to deal with those chemicals. And same thing with different types of caterpillars and other insects as well. The other 10% of insects are generalists, but studies by Doug Tallamy indicate that that 10% cannot make up for the other 90%. So generalists can usually eat pretty much whatever, that, you know, like tent worms, things like that. But again, they're not going to be enough to make up for the loss of our specialists. And they also, in his studies, he's finding that they don't use non-native plants nearly as much as they do native plants. So even the generalists generally prefer native plants over non-native plants. Another really interesting fact I just recently learned with Heather Holm, who is a bee expert, even our native bees, a majority of them are specialists. So for example, there are a specific type of bee, they can only feed on dogwood pollen. And so they come out when the dogwoods bloom, and then they're dormant for pretty much the rest of the year. So it's not just our caterpillars, there is a whole range of insects that are specialists that we need to make sure that we're providing food for them. And again, I said I would say this a whole bunch of times, native plants really are the base of the entire food web. All right, a few other reasons why we should plant native plants. They use a lot less water after establishment, which I'll give you an example here in just a few minutes. They reduce or eliminate the use of pesticides or synthetic fertilizers. Native plants are generally adapted to the type of soil that you're going to plant them in because they're from that area. So they're really not going to need much more, if anything, that we need to provide for them other than what's already there in the soil. They're more suited to our environment because they evolved here. They evolved in these conditions. And yes, with climate change, we are going to have to, you know, pay more attention to them, see what they need. But in general, they're used to the conditions that are in their native range. They stabilize the soil via a robust root system, which we will take a look at here in just a minute. And because they're beautiful. I've heard too many times that people say, oh, they're just weeds. They're not weeds. They're really beautiful. At the end of this presentation, I'll run through some of the pictures that I've taken at the Botanical Garden of the Ozarks to show you just how beautiful native plants can be. All right, so this is a wonderful example of non-native roots versus native roots. So you can see even the shallowest of the native plants in this particular example, their roots go twice as deep as the non-natives. The deepest one, the common 9-bark, is 3 times as deep in the soil as the non-natives. So this means that natives are going to increase water infiltration into the soil, which reduces runoff. So that's mitigation of storms and climate change. They sequester more carbon because they have a larger root mass and it's deeper in the soil. And then their root systems, because they're so deep, they're more able to access water deep in the soil, which generally makes them more drought hardy, which makes it easier for us to take care of them. And also having those deep, robust root systems means that when we do have a harsh winter, they're going to be more able to withstand that and come back from their roots because they have such a deep and protected root system. And this chart, this was shown to me by Lissa, and it's so abundantly clear in here how much easier and better it is for the environment to use a sustainable or native landscape. So a traditional landscape with your non-native species, you're going to use approximately 57,000 gallons of water to water that through a season. Whereas with a native landscape, you're only going to use 6,000 gallons. From a traditional landscape, you will have 670 pounds of yard waste. And from a native or sustainable landscape, you're only going to have 250 pounds of yard waste. You'll spend 80 hours approximately maintaining your traditional landscape and only 15 hours maintaining your sustainable landscape. So it's going to save you time, and it's going to save you money, and it's going to support the entire ecosystem. So it's really, it's a win-win situation. All right, so we've talked about what's the problem, why is it important, what do natives provide for us, and what do they do for the ecosystem, but what can we do? So we have the idea of what the problem is, but what can we do so that we can start to change this and turn this around? So I really believe that we as gardeners, whether we are home gardeners, professional gardeners, where we have clients, or we work at a botanical garden like myself, we are the front line. We are the group of people who can start to turn this around and change the tide, bring back our insects, start to help the ecosystem. If we all do at least a little bit in our yards at home, we can start to make the difference. Part of the problem that we talk about with habitat fragmentation is that insects, they don't generally fly very far. So if you, let's say I have a pawpaw tree at my house which supports zebra swallowtails, and then my friend who lives, 50, 60 miles away has a pawpaw tree, but there aren't any trees in between, then the likelihood of my zebra swallowtail making it to the other pawpaw 50, 60 miles away is very slight. And so if all of us in our urban, suburban, or even rural landscapes start to add these plants back to our yards, we can really make a difference. And that's what I'm hoping to inspire you to do today. So what can we do? So you can use a variety of native annuals, perennials, trees, and shrubs. And you want to try to spread out the bloom time as much as possible to encompass as much of the year as possible. There are even some winter bloomers like witch hazel. So if you have a warm day and the bees come out on that day, there's some food for them available. And you want to think about creating not just a beautiful garden space, but habitat as well. So using a variety of native trees and shrubs so that you more mimic what you'll see in the natural world, so that there are different heights for birds to nest in or animals to hide in. Because again, we're talking about the whole food web. Even though we're mostly focusing on the base of it, we're really talking about all of the food web. We want to excuse me, yes, so create shady spaces for the animals to hide. And then when you're using cultivated natives, which we're seeing a lot more of in the landscape, you really need to keep an eye on pollinator interest. So what a lot of people are finding who are really paying attention to cultivated natives is they don't always support insects in the same way that the straight native does. So what do I mean by that? So let's say, for example, you have a native redbud, Cirrus canadensis. That's a host plant for several different caterpillars. But you go to the nursery and you see one called forest pansy, and it has these beautiful purple leaves, and you're like, wow, I get purple leaves and I get to support these butterflies as caterpillar stage. Unfortunately, no. What they're finding is that once you change the chemistry of the leaf and you change the color of the leaf, it does not support our insects in the same way. They may still be able to use the flowers for pollen and or nectar, but they're not going to support the leaf eating stage, which is generally caterpillars. I've even seen in my own experience, and I don't have a scientific study, so I'd really need to study it more, but others have observed some similar things as well. So on this page, you see this beautiful swallowtail. There on Vernonia, which is a common name is Ironweed, which is a native here in Arkansas. And this plant is generally about 5 or 6 feet tall. And you can see we have this beautiful swallowtail on it. Well, there's a cultivated native called iron butterfly, which I absolutely love, and I do have in my garden at home. It only gets about probably, I think, 2.5, 3 feet tall. So it's generally what people call much more suited for a smaller or home garden. But what I have observed is that generally I will only see skippers on it. So those are much smaller, different type of butterfly. Only one time in all the years that I've had it, both at home and at the botanical gardens, which has been about, I think, 6 or 7 years now, I've only ever once seen anything larger than a skipper using that plant. So it is still supporting pollinators, but not necessarily the same pollinators. And so we really need to think about, you know, if I plant the forest pansy redbud, or I plant the iron butterfly, do I have enough room to also plant the straight species, the one that, you know, that I would see if I was out in nature? And I would really encourage you, if you do, you know, go ahead and plant both. Plant the things that you like, but also plant the things that you know for sure are going to support the entire life cycle of our native insects. And then also another important thing is planting the same flowers in large blocks. So planting 3 to 5 next to each other it increases the space, and then pollinators are much more easily able to see that block of plants, whether it's the plant that they eat as a caterpillar and the female is going to lay on it, or if it's the nectar and pollen that they're going for. It just makes it easier for them to see that as they're flying over and be able to access that food. Other things that we can do as gardeners. You can provide fresh water. So I really love this setup that you see on the left-hand side. It's easy to clean. The rock comes right down to the water, which is very important because unlike us, insects don't have wastes. So they can't bend down the way that we can for water, so that the access point for them needs to be right at the water level. You know, the ones with the glass beads, or marbles, they're pretty, but they're going to be hard to clean. They get algae in them, they get dirty, and you know, it's just better if we can provide fresh, clean water for them. And so this setup is much easier in order for us to be able to do that. I really encourage you to not use pesticides at all in your yard, or if you do, try to be very selective. So for example, in my vegetable garden, generally the only thing that I use as far as pesticides is BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, and I usually only use it in the fall for my cole crops, so things like my cabbage, kale, broccoli, things like that. And it's only going to target the caterpillars on those plants and only the caterpillars that actually eat those plants. You know, pesticides, we use them in our yard and we think we're killing one thing, but we end up killing a lot more than that. So as much as possible, and really with the more native plants that you have in your yard, the more relationships are there where certain insects eat other insects that we feel are pest insects. They're going to take care of that for you. Again, just try not to use pesticides in your yard. And then don't forget about our other garden friends. Again, we're talking about the entire food web, all of nature, how we're supporting it. Every single thing that we do to support insects, including native plants, are going to support our other garden friends, like our toads, frogs, salamanders, and many more. In the bottom right-hand picture, you'll see this adorable little toad. I love toads. I've loved them since I was a little girl. I don't know why. I just think they're adorable. I was gardening one day in my vegetable garden, and I went to dig out some soil so that I could put a plant in there, and out popped this little toad. And what that tells me is that I'm doing the right thing. So what I'm doing in my yard is supporting nature, because this little toad decided to come nestle down in the soil in my yard. And those are the things that really make me happy. All right, other things that we can do. We can reduce our lawn area by planting more native garden, pollinator gardens, and rain gardens. Lawns are really akin to a monoculture species. They don't support anything. So the more space that we can fill in with native plants, whether they're again in a straight native garden, a pollinator garden, or a rain garden, we're just going to increase the likelihood that we're able to support nature's food web and reduce the amount of lawn that we have. You can feed the birds by creating an insect sanctuary full of host plants, which that's what we've been talking about, and I'll get into that specific here in just a minute. Habitat and native plants with winter berries. So things like, you know, Echinacea, leaving the seed heads up, using native hollies, those will all support birds. And then I also want to touch on studies by Doug Tallamy have shown that we need 70% of the plants in our yard to be native plants. And then once you have less than native, that percentage of native plants, the support for the ecosystem starts to really drop off. So this study has been done with chickadees, and then he's recently had a graduate student who has also done it with other types of birds. And anytime the percentage of native plants drops below 70%, you start to see less baby birds being raised in those areas. Now, I do realize maybe not all of us have the space, or maybe we've already filled in a lot of our garden space with non-native plants. So maybe think about what you could replace. And even if we can't do 70%, if we all do the best we can, it's still going to help nature and help the food web. Now, along with Doug Tallamy's study of the 70% natives, what he found is that for chickadees, which remember are small birds, to raise a clutch of 5 chickadees, between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars are needed. And for baby birds, caterpillars are the #1 form of food. They're high in the different nutrients that they need. They're also very easy for a baby bird to eat. But think about that. Think how small a chickadee is, and the fact that they need 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars in order to make it from the time they hatch until they're able to go off on their own. Imagine how much is needed for larger birds and all of the birds that we really want to try to support. Another thing to know is with hummingbirds, you know, we normally think of them as eating nectar or coming to our bird feeders and eating sugar water. But the truth is 80% of their diet are insects and spiders. And so even our little hummingbirds, which we generally don't think of as insect eaters, eat insects. So again, it's just a really important part of the food web. And then you also want to ensure that your soil is healthy to support healthy plants. So you can take a soil sample, reach out to your local extension office. They'll explain to you how to do that, making sure that all the nutrients that your plants need are available for them there in the soil. What else can you do? So you can replace the trees and shrubs in your yard that don't provide insects, food for insects or for wildlife. You can dig out invasive plants and don't use them in your yard, and tolerate some plant damage. Remember, we're planting native plants so that insects can eat them. Remember way back at the beginning when we started this talk, I talked about, you know, don't be sad that you have holes in your leaves, be happy. That means that you are providing food for the insects and for nature. And then use a well-researched plant list to choose your plant material. I think with native plants, people sometimes get overwhelmed by the fact they're not familiar with them. There are so many of them. They're like, oh, but they pop up everywhere. How do I know which ones to plant in my yard so I'm not just constantly weeding? Well, the great thing is Lissa Morrison, again, my mentor, has been working for several decades putting together this amazing plant list called Well-Behaved Natives. And you can see that at bgozarks.org. So that's bgozarks.org. Go to our Learn tab and then Info on Native Plants, and her list is there. And this list is amazing because it has trees, shrubs, perennials, what size they're going to get to, what their requirements are, and then how many Lepidoptera, and Lepidoptera are moth and butterfly species that those plants support. So not every native plant will necessarily support them, but it will give you a much better idea of what which ones they do support. It also helps you know, okay, so I can plant this in my yard, and I'm not going to be out there next spring for hours and hours on end weeding it out of my garden bed, or it's not going to take over by suckers underground and just take over my whole garden bed. So it's just an amazing list that she has compiled that she's happy to share with the world to make it easier for us to support nature. All right, so host plants. This is exactly what we've been talking about today. When I talked about insects being specialist, that means they can only eat one species or several species within a genus of plants. And so those plants are called their host plants. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the spice bush caterpillar. And all three of these pictures are from our butterfly house at the Botanical Garden of the Ozarks. So if you want to see some of our native butterflies in all different stages, from egg to caterpillar, chrysalid, and adult, please come by. It depends on the time of year what will be there, but we have quite a few species in there. So I love the spice bush caterpillar because he's just so cute. The eyes that you see they're not actually eyes, they're pseudo eyes. And when he feels threatened, his head puffs up and makes him look like a snake. And so that's one of the defense mechanisms that they have. Their mouth, eyes, everything are actually at the very base, which you can see right here. That is actually where their head is. The middle one is a pipe vine swallowtail. And although it looks venomous, those spikes are actually quite rubbery, and it's feeding on a pipe vine because that's what it feeds on. And then on the right-hand side, we have one of our giant swallowtails, and its defense mechanism is to look like bird droppings. And when startled, they have an appendage that comes out of the top of their head, which also smells like bird droppings. So just really interesting ways that they try to camouflage and keep themselves safe. Every plant listed here except for dill and parsley are plants that are both host plants and native to Arkansas. So, you know, I was really interested to find when I started looking into it that Joe Pieweed, Baptisia, yellow and purple coneflower. They're all host and nectar plants. So it's just, again, it's amazing when you really start looking into it, the amount of native plants that are host plants as well. Dill and parsley, I did put them on here because although, yes, we're talking about native plants, they are really good host plants for swallowtails. There's something that we already typically plant in our vegetable gardens. So typically what people will see on them is a swallowtail caterpillar. They think it's a monarch because this particular swallowtail is different than the one that you see on your screen. And their stripe pattern is very similar to a monarch, but they're different colors. So if you see something on your dill or your parsley that looks like a monarch, it's not, but it is a native swallowtail. So just be sure to leave that and maybe plant a little extra for them as well. All right, and I also want to point out that not all plants are created equal. So you can see that oak, their genus is Quercus. If you plant a native oak, you could support up to, a little over 500 species of moths or butterflies. Native pine, just over 200. Walnut, about 130. And then tulip poplar, just 1. So I do love tulip poplars. They are beautiful. But if you have the space for an oak or a tulip poplar, I'm going to highly encourage you to plant the oak tree, again, a native oak tree. And that is because they just support hundreds of species of butterflies and moths, which again is going to support our entire food web. Now, how do you know if something is native to your area? Not just to the United States, but specifically to wherever you are within the United States. So this is a great free resource. It's called BONAP. So what you can do is you just go to a search engine like Google and you type in the genus. So like I just mentioned, the genus for oak is Quercus, and you type in Quercus BONAP, and then you click on the first one that comes up, and it will have this map, but for multiple different species. So it will show you if it's introduced, and it has a color code on there as well, so you can figure out what the colors mean. If it is native, which you'll see in the dark green, and then if it's native and abundant. So native and abundant is the light green. So that really tells you, again, if it's native in your area, if it's abundant, which kind of tells you also if it's going to grow well in your area. So this is a great free resource that you can use to figure out what's native in your area. Okay, so we've talked about, what the problem is, why it's important, what we can do. So now you've planted your native garden. Well, how the heck do you care for it? Is it different than a regular garden? So most of it is the same, but there are going to be just a few things that I want to touch base on to make sure that you know. So again, choose well-behaved natives. Go and check out Lissa's list on the Botanical Garden of the Ozarks website, so you can see what well-behaved natives are that she has tested herself throughout the past few decades. A great tip that I learned working with Lissa at the Botanical Gardens is you want to shear your mid to late summer bloomers down by half or no lower than 15 inches at the end of May. What this does is it controls the size, keeps your beds a little tidier. They'll bloom a little later than they normally would, but then when we have these late summer or early autumn, those really heavy rainstorms that we get, you're not going to have those tall things flopping all over. So those can be things like black-eyed Susan or some of our native sunflowers. It's just a really great way to keep them more upright so that either they don't flop or you don't have to take the time to tie them up. You want to plant according to mature size, not current size. So when you look at something like Ironweed or a New England aster, they each get about 3 to 4 feet wide. So if you plant them a foot apart from each other, eventually they're going to mate or marry, I guess would not mate, marry together, and they're going to be kind of intermingled, which you may be fine with, but most people I have found like that cleaner look. So keeping them apart will prevent them from marrying, and generally will keep them a little healthier because they'll have a little more airflow around them as well. You can prune and shape your native trees and shrubs just like you do your non-natives, and that keeps them healthy as well. And you want to use leaf mulch and grass clippings for mulch instead of bark if you can. It just, again, it more mimics what they would have in the natural world. And then you can water very little or not at all after the establishment period, which is about 1 to 2 years. So I actually have one garden bed at home. It's one of the first ones that I planted at my house. And after the establishment period, I went 3 years without having to water it. Now, during those 3 years, we got about 1 inch of water every probably 2 to 3 weeks. But that was enough to where I didn't have to supplemental water at all. My plants were healthy, they were happy. That bed is probably about 75 to 80% natives. And then the rest are things that are drought hardy. So again, just things that I don't have to water very much. Now, I do want to make a special note about right plant, right place. So we talk a lot about natives being drought hardy, that we don't have to water them as much, but we have to think about and mimic what they live in the natural world. So for example, pussy willow, beautiful native plant, host plant, I can't plant that in my garden that I barely water because it generally likes to have its feet wet. So it, will grow closer to a riverbank or a pond, and it needs more water than my drought hardy natives. So you really, when you're looking at your natives, think about, okay, what natural conditions do they grow in, and how can I mimic that at home? So it's just one more caveat to keep in mind. All right, so we've, again, figured out what the problem is. We've drawn insects to our yard. We've provided all this wonderful food for them, but there's one more step that we have to think about, and that's how do we get them through winter? If we don't get them through winter, they can't complete their life cycle, and most of what we have done already is in vain. So first I want to touch on how do insects make it through winter. So they go into a state called diapause, which is akin to hibernation, and it is an inactive state of development. Inactive state of arrested development. There are other kinds, including avoiding summer heat in the tropics or desert, and food shortages in the tropics. Here, they're doing it because the temperature has dropped, and they need to survive possible freezing temperatures or just temperatures that they can't do well in, and or there's not food available for them. So insects actually produce basically a type of antifreeze, which stops their cells from bursting in freezing weather. And depending on the type of insect, they may overwinter as eggs or juvenile stages such as nymph, larva, or pupa, or even as adults. They may overwinter under bark, in the ground, in leaf litter, on egg masses, or other ways as well. So they have a multitude of different ways depending on the insect as to how they're going to overwinter. And then diapause ends, in this case, as the weather warms up, once the days are consistently around 50 or 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So this picture was provided for me by Kitty Sanders, who Eric mentioned will be giving a class, I believe it was next week, again, focusing on pollinators. Her class is different than mine, but definitely she's a great presenter. I think you'll really enjoy listening to what she has to say. She's our main butterfly nanny and does our butterfly program for us at the Botanical Garden of the Ozarks. These are two different swallowtails. They're in their pupa or chrysalid stage, and this is how they're going to make it through winter. They're just going to stay this way until it warms up, and then they will come back out and turn into butterflies. All right, so now we know how they make it through winter, but what can we as gardeners do to help them make it through winter? So leave your ornamental garden beds messy. And I know this is, again, it goes against mostly everything we've been taught as gardeners, but it's such an important concept and thing for us to do to really help our insects make it all the way through their life cycle. So you want to wait until the first week of March, or again, until temperatures are generally around 50 or 60 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, because your insects are going to overwinter in your ornamental beds. There are 20 different species of insects that overwinter in a native plant called cup plant, Silphium perfoliatum. In Solidago, goldenrod, there are galls formed by wasps and beetles that overwinter in the stems. And I know some people are saying, I can't stand the mess, or I don't have time in the spring to clean up all of my garden bed and plant my vegetable garden, or have all the other things that I have going on in my life. So what I'm going to encourage you to do at that point then is pick and choose. So if you have, if you've really done a great job, or even if you just have some native plants in your yard, only cut them back to 15 inches, the stems of the plant. Next year, that green growth is going to come up, it's going to cover them over. Or maybe you just can't stand it and you have to clean up that front bed in front of your house. You don't want people going by and seeing a messy bed. Okay, so go ahead and clean that. Put your stems back in the compost pile. They're not going to compost much in the winter. Maybe start a leaf pile. Just really try to pick and choose what you're doing so that you can still help insects overwinter. Now, native bees snuggle under bark, leaf litter, decomposing logs, hollow stems of plants, and also in the ground. And not even just hollow stems, but pithy stems. So they can actually dig out portions of the stems in order for them to live in. And plenty of other insects overwinter in the leaf litter as well. So assassin bugs, which are beneficial, lacewings, ground beetles, damsel bugs, ones that eat what we consider pest insects in our own gardens, they're going to overwinter in the leaf litter. So again, just picking and choosing is really important. On the bottom right-hand side of the screen, right in the middle here, this is, I believe, either a Luna moth, or I'm blanking on the other name of the moth that it could be, but that's a cocoon that I found in one of my gardens this spring in the leaf litter. And the moth was still inside, not quite ready to come out. So I found, I just went back to one of the corners where I allow leaf litter to pile up and stay, and I just tucked it down in there so that it could finish its development and come out when it was ready. So these are some of the, neat surprises that you'll get in your yard when you allow nature to take its course. All right, so you do want to clean up the debris from your vegetable garden and fruit trees. You want to compost them unless they're diseased, and then the best thing to do would be to throw them away. The reason is that with our vegetable gardens and fruit gardens, they often do have a higher likelihood of having some type of like fungal or bacterial disease that you don't want to leave in the soil, because it means you're more likely to have to use pesticides the next year. So it's really good to just clean those up, but not your ornamental beds. You want to leave the rest of the leaves in the garden beds, on your lawn. I know, again, some people can't stand the mess, or I have a friend who I did leaf cleanup for one year, and if they left the leaves every year, they wouldn't have a lawn because they just have such heavy tree canopy. So if you can't leave them in the garden beds, or you can't leave them on the lawn, then what I would encourage you to do is to make leaf composting piles. So leaf composting takes several years. So within that given amount of time, the insects are going to be able to complete their life cycle. You'll have great leaf mulch that you can use on your garden beds. So it's a win for them and a win for you. But really important is do not burn your leaves. If you burn your leaves, you're burning the, the beautiful Luna moth cocoon that you saw on my last slide, or the multitude of other insects that are overwintering in your leaf litter. So burning is really the last thing that we would want to do. Leaving a few bare patches of soil in the less traveled areas, more protected areas of your yard. Again, as gardeners, kind of goes against everything we've been taught. We've been taught to mulch, which I believe is a good practice. However, a majority of our native bees are solitary and they're ground nesting bees. So they look for those bare patches of soil so that they can easily dig into the soil and make their nests and their homes in there. So it's really important that we leave that for them. I would also encourage you not to use wasp traps or bug zappers. I know that in general, and I understand with wasps, their sting is painful, it hurts, and some people are allergic to them, but very few of us are. And so, wasps are not only important to the ecosystem in general, they are pollinators and they are parasitoids. So what is a parasitoid? So parasitoid is like an insect. In this particular instance, wasps will lay their eggs inside of a tomato hornworm. Their eggs hatch out, eat the inside of the hornworm dies. They also lay their eggs in aphids, so they're really beneficial, especially to vegetable gardeners, because they're going to kill the insects that we don't want. And then bug zappers are indiscriminate killers. To me, that's basically akin to using a broad spectrum pesticide. It's literally going to kill everything that comes in contact with it. So, if you're worried about mosquitoes, there are traps that you can hang up that just trap mosquitoes. There are other options that you can use rather than getting a bug zapper, which is going to kill everything that it comes in contact with. And don't forget about the birds. Again, we're talking about the whole food web. So other things that we can do, you can leave up things like your black-eyed Susan seed heads, Echinacea seed heads. Plant things like deciduous hollies like Ilex decidua, Ilex vomitoria, or the native beautyberry Calicarpa americana, which have berries that are rich in fat, which are really important for birds to make it through winter. And plus, if you plant them close enough to your house where you can see them, you get to enjoy seeing beautiful birds on those cold winter days where the sun hasn't been out for a while, and it just really cheers you up and warms your heart. All right, and last but not least, leave at least one rotting log, even if it's a small portion, somewhere undisturbed in your yard. Bees will overwinter in them and lay their eggs in them. I've talked several times about leaving your stems, cutting them no shorter than 15 inches. Again, that's because some insects, and especially our native bees, will use them year round as a home. And in general, the new foliage, the new stems that are going to come up the following year are going to cover over those, so you're not going to see them. And have a multi-species lawn. At my house, it's grass, it's weeds, it's everything in between. But the things I love about it is I have little flowers in my yard that some people have never seen in their entire lives. And I get to go out and walk through my yard and see all these beautiful little flowers, and they support nature. Dandelions, I say bring them on. I love dandelions. I've loved them since I was a little girl. And also with a multi-species lawn, there's little to no fertilizing, pesticide use, or even watering. I've never watered my lawn in the 9 years that I've lived at my house. Occasionally during a hot, dry summer, I'll have some brown patches. And I know those of you with the HOA, it can be more difficult. But if you don't live in an HOA and you're able to just let your lawn be what it is, I really, really encourage you to do that. And then last, I really hope that you can learn to appreciate the winter garden, the browns, and the bones. You know, brown is such a beautiful color that we appreciate in so many other aspects. We have wooden furniture. We love brown hair, brown eyes. There's so many browns in the world that we love, but for some reason we don't love it in our gardens. And so if we can see the different shades of brown and how beautiful they are, or you walk through your garden and you have two trees or shrubs that are approximately the same size and shape, but then when the leaves are gone, you see the bark and the structure and how incredibly beautiful, you know, again, the bark, the shape, the structure, all of that is that we miss when they're covered with leaves. And I think in today's fast-paced world, at least for me, it helps me slow down and it helps me really just and see what's in front of me, and it helps the world just fall away. So it's just a really great way to enjoy nature and enjoy the beautiful gardens that we've created. All right, and right before we get to some beautiful pictures of natives, I want to give you my references. So again, I've mentioned her several times, Lissa Morrison, native plant educator and landscape designer, Vice President of Wild Ones Ozark Chapter. Doug Tallamy, he now has, I believe, 3 books out. I encourage you to read every single one of them. He really gives great information onto why natives are important and some great information on how to use some of them. Bugguide.net is a great reference for figuring out what the heck that bug is. There are also some great entomology sites on Facebook if you're on Facebook. Bonap.org, again, where we talked about how to figure out if something is native or not. And then butterfliesandmoths.org, which is a great resource just to learn about butterflies and moths, but also to figure out what plants are host plants so that you can figure out what you want to plant in your yard to support them. And then also if there are specific ones that you want to draw to your yard, you can find them on there and find out what plants you need to plant. All right, so I did mention briefly that natives really are beautiful. So let's take a look at some of those beautiful plants. So this is a Morpha canescens lead plant, and you can just see those beautiful orange anthers with the purple petals, the frilly foliage. It's an absolutely gorgeous plant. This is Asclepius tuberosa, which is a host plant for monarchs, white tussock moths, several beetles, and you can see it's also a nectar plant. You can see this adorable little bee getting nectar and probably pollen as well from the flowers. Echinacea Paradoxa. There are lots of different types of echinacea. This is just one of them. Echinacea purpurea, what we commonly think of as echinacea and are most familiar with. Hydrangea arborescens, smooth hydrangea. This hydrangea is actually pretty versatile. In nature, you'll typically see it in part shade or even sometimes deep shade. You can also put it in full sun and it will make this incredible shrub that you see here. You do have to watch it though. It does like to really run with runners underneath the ground. So you need to plant it in the right space or give it the space it needs to do that. Oak leaf hydrangea, Hydrangea quercifolia, which is native to certain parts of Arkansas. Utropium purpurium, commonly known as Joe Pye weed. It's a great plant. You can use it in the back of your garden. It's a host plant and nectar plant. Lonicera sempervirens, which is a native honeysuckle. It does not have the smell that the invasive Japanese one does, but it does have these incredible 2-inch long tubular flowers, which generally you'll see at least a handful of flowers on this plant most of the year. It also provides berries for birds, and it's a host plant for clear-wing moths. So you really, it's a gorgeous plant, and it provides so many different ecosystem services. It's really incredible. This is either Asclepius purpurea or Syriaca. I'm not 100% sure because I can't see the leaves as well as I would like to, I think it's probably Purpurea because Syriaca tends to have more of a mauve, lighter color. But those are two different types of other Asclepius that are native to Arkansas. This is Parthenium integrifolium, or wild quinine. I just love these flowers. I think they're so beautiful. They make great dried flowers, and they're so interesting. They're so different than what we typically see in our flowers in Arkansas. This is Penstemon Murianis. A lot of penstemons don't do well in Arkansas, but since this one is native, it does really well here. You can see how unique the leaves are, the gorgeous color of the flowers. They have these great, beautiful straight stalks, and it really is just a gorgeous plant. This is some type of Rudbeckia or Black-Eyed Susan. I'm not 100% sure on the species on this, so we're just going to go with Black-Eyed Susan, and because there are so many different ones that you can plant in your yard, and they're really beautiful, and they support a lot of different pollinators. And then Ironweed. So Ironweed vernonia, again, is a native plant, supports our native pollinators, is a really beautiful bloomer. Gets very tall, so it's good for the back part of your garden, but just a really great native plant. All right, and so to wrap everything up, please remember that larvae, aka caterpillars, are food. Without larvae, our birds will disappear. So welcome the holes in your yard, don't use pesticides, leave the leaves, and plant natives. And thank you all so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. If there's one thing I love almost as much as gardening, it's getting to share the love of native plants and insects and nature in general with people. So just, again, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. And be back to Eric.
All right. Thank you, Megan. That was an excellent presentation. A lot of great information. Been seeing a lot of great, excellent feedback from people here in the chat. I know I definitely learned a lot. So we do have a couple of questions. Ruth Ann Hill, she did have to leave, but she had entered a question about the cone flowers that are in the garden, the native plant section and garden centers. She was concerned if there are certain varieties that are native to this area or any that are not, that she needs to look for or look out for.
Sure, anything that has a name with it, so something like pom-pom or typically anything that has a name beyond just the species. So like Echinacea Purpuria, that's a native, but if it's Echinacea Cheyenne Spirit, those are not a native, or they could be a cultivated native. So the best thing to do is, go to your search engine, type in Echinacea Bonap, look up the ones that are native, and then try to find those from your garden center.
All right. And Carolina had a question about raking leaves. What are your thoughts on raking leaves? You mentioned not burning them.
Sure, I think raking them is fine, but again, I would try to find a space where you can do leaf composting so that you pile them in an area in your yard or even within a cage so that those insects still have the chance to overwinter in them. But as long as you're not, burning them or, taking them to the landfill, you're finding a way to compost them slowly in your own backyard, then the insects should be fine in them.
All right. And then Carla has a question. What plants are on your top 5 list?
Oh gosh, that is hard because I realized as I started talking about native plants probably about a few months ago that whenever I talked about them, I noticed that they're all my favorites. So that is hard for me to say. I would say oaks for sure, because they provide so many different, or it's a host plant for so many different caterpillars and moths. Echinacea, gosh, any of the Echinaceas, Purpurea, any of them, they're just really beautiful. They support a lot of different pollinators. And even though it's not a well-behaved native, Silphium perfoliatum or cup plant, because it has this really unique leaf that hugs the stem, and dew and rain go down the leaf and then make this little pool on the stem, so birds and insects can come drink from that. There are 20 different insects that overwinter in the stem itself. And then when they bloom, you can see 10 to 20 different native pollinators using the blooms. Another not well-behaved native, but still one of my favorites, is mountain mint, which I can't think of the scientific name at the moment. But again, you'll see tons of pollinators on it, and you can use the seed heads as dried arrangements in the winter. So I think those would be my top 4. I'm not sure what the 5th would be. I'd have to think about that.
Okay, we have one person asked, let's see, I had a whole bunch come up at once. Are red maples and silver maples okay?
Silver maples, no, I'm thinking of sugar maples. I would have to, again, look at the scientific name to see if they're native to this area. So again, what your best bet is to do is try to find the scientific name of that tree, look it up, and see if it's native to this area. I think most red maples are more of a northern tree, so they're not necessarily bad, but they're not going to support natives in the way that you're hoping the rest of them will. And right now I'm blanking on whether it's silver or sugar maple. Maybe Eric will know for me which one is native to our area. But as much as possible, again, try to find the ones that are native to Arkansas to support wildlife.
And I believe both of those are native to this part of Arkansas. We definitely have more red. I noticed a lot more red maples than sugar maples.
Yeah.
Pam Moss says they're just starting over with a large area for native plants. Do you have any advice for layering native plants?
Yeah, I would suggest Doug Talamay has a book that he did with another author that talks about looking at nature and looking at the structure of how nature layers those plants and teaching you how to mimic that in your own backyard.
Danny Barron has asked about what are our native nurseries. I know in this area, we in Northwest Arkansas, master naturalists grow a lot from local ecotypes, and the money they make goes back into that volunteer organization, and they also donate a lot to nonprofits and school projects, that sort of thing. And there's also Ozark Soul native plants out of Springfield, Missouri. There's Ozark native plants out of St. Paul, Arkansas. Wild Streak native plants out of West Fork. Mm-hmm. And there is, I know I'm always forget one. Have I missed one, Megan?
White River. White River
White
is
River.
A place. They have a lot of great ones.
Yeah. Pine Ridge.
Yeah. Yes, and Pine Ridge Gardens. Yes.
Right down in London, Arkansas. Yeah. Oh. Okay. Let's see if there are any other questions I've missed. Regine Skelton, I guess sugar maple is not native to Arkansas. Okay. Well, I do see it a lot out in the wild. I believe its range is just north of here, and I've seen it in the Ozarks. You can differentiate it from red maple. Maybe it's been naturalized here, though. Let's see. Silver maple is native, same as sugar. Actually, sugar maple. Okay, there's a debate on sugar. Okay, let me see if I have any questions or anything from anyone. A lot of people are saying great presentation. I think we'll maybe just have to kind of cut it there. I do want to mention a few things. First of all, thank you, Megan, for sharing your time and expertise with us. It was a wonderful presentation, and we really do appreciate it. I want to thank everyone again for being with us here today. Again, the recording of this webinar is going to be uploaded to our YouTube channel, so please check that out. Just go to YouTube and type in Wild Ones Ozark Chapter, and our channel should come up. If you email me or have emailed me to request a link for this, I will be following up with a link to another recording, and I'll try to include the link to the YouTube recording as well, just so you have both. Our next webinar is going to be Wednesday, October 14th. It's Kitty Sanders, also from the Botanical Garden of the Ozarks. She will be presenting Be a Friend to Monarchs and Other Pollinators. In the meantime, you can contact us at wildonesozarkchapter@gmail.com or look at our Facebook page or follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/OzarkWildOnes. And if you want to join, go to wildones.org month/membership, and you can join for as low as $25. So we appreciate everybody, and we're looking forward to seeing everyone again on October 14th. Have a good day.